Hello everybody, welcome to Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver 2. This is the third game in the series coming after Blood Omen and Soul Reaver. You might recognize the opening sequence as the final exchange Raziel and Kain have at the end of Soul Reaver, so we're picking up right where we left off. The conversation is exactly the same, except with a couple lines cut, but I will go over it again, highlighting it in a slightly different way. So let's get started, and I hope you enjoy. So we open on this one with Raziel entering the chronoplast chamber. Kain asks Raziel if it troubled him to murder his brothers, to which Raziel asks, "Did it trouble you to order me into the abyss?" Kain changes the subject, saying he could not originally fathom the power to be gained from knowing the past of the future tracing out into the infinite. He goes on to say that vampires are so much more than they once were, and that as long as a single one of them stands, they're vegan. And he says he learns how futures are predestined ever since Mobius told his eons ago. Raziel then says that he found the tomb of the Seraphan, and that he's angry at Kain for profaning the priests. Kain says that the Seraphan ultimately had the same objectives as the vampires, so they would serve him well. During this conversation, Kain's fiddling with dials within the chamber, and he activates a portal. He steps through, saying fate promises more twists before this drama unfolds. Raziel goes to pursue, following him through the portal, and when he emerges on the other side, he runs into Mobius, who seems quite friendly and welcomes Raziel by name to his destiny. Mobius confirms Raziel traveled through time, and his staff seems to disable the Reaver, for which he apologizes, saying the staff is supposed to incapacitate vampires, and that he means no harm. Raziel says he knows who Mobius is, and that he should kill him where he stands, to which Mobius says, yeah, he probably should, but he doesn't, as Kain gets that honor about 30 years from now. Raziel then asks how Mobius knows his name, and he says that they were close during Raziel's days as a Seraphan. Raziel kind of scoffs at this, and then recognizes this as his Seraphan stronghold. Mobius says that while the days of the Seraphan have passed, he and his mercenaries try to keep their memory alive. We see images of Vorador, and Mobius talks about how he was the scourge of the Circle and slaughtered 6 Circle members, but he and 2 other Guardians conveniently managed to escape. Raziel says he still doesn't really trust Mobius, but Mobius says he doesn't really need Raziel's trust in order for him to help Raziel kill Kain. Mobius then shows Raziel that Kain is waiting for him at the pillars, while confirming that he diverted Raziel here to the stronghold in order to have this chat. Mobius is clearly trying to reinforce that Kain must die because he is destined to destroy the pillars that the Guardians are trying to protect, causing the cataclysmic future with which Raziel is familiar. Mobius says to go finish things with Kain, but the mercenaries won't understand Raziel's appearance, so he's going to have to fight his way out, but keep the casualties to a minimum. Mobius disappears, and as Raziel's leaving too, he makes note of another time-streaming chamber for future use. Then, as Raziel's going through the stronghold, he sees the stone and glasswork and comments on the noble heritage that Kain stole from him. He continues forward into the central hall, and the Reaver returns after having spent some time away from Mobius' staff. Raziel says he understands how all the various vampire crusades were so successful if the staff that Mobius used could immobilize his enemies, and he also kind of stops to wonder why it affected the Reaver in the way it did. When he reaches the inner sanctum, he begins to feel a sense of vertigo and displacement. We find the source of this feeling that he's getting is the Soul Reaver resting on the tomb of King William the Just. We also see here an image of King William being assassinated by Kain. Raziel recounts the story of how Kain was coerced by Mobius to go back in time to do this, which is what catalyzed the current mercenary crusade against vampires. The Reaver lies here, still broken from William's fight with Kain, and Raziel, mesmerized, reaches out and watches as the Wraithblade coils around its twin. He then feels the ravenous will of his Reaver awaken as it begins to leech his soul in order to repair its past self. It completes the job and releases Raziel before destroying him. Then, after this whole process, he feels that the Reaver is no longer just his symbiotic weapon, and that it's now willful and competing for control. Mobius then shows up, and Raziel asks what's happening to him. Mobius deflects blames to Kain, saying that he came without his staff as a show of good faith. Raziel then threatens him with the 2 Reavers, and Mobius is clearly terrified, saying that Raziel has no idea what he's doing. At this time, Mobius mentions the Wheel of Fate, and this is kind of a red flag for Raziel, and Mobius does confirm that it does in fact serve the Elder. Raziel then says it's enough knowing that Mobius is frightened of him, and tosses aside the Reaver, saying he's going to go find Kain at the pillars. Mobius is kind of like, yeah, go find him and kill him, and Raziel's kind of like, I'll do whatever I want to do. Heading out, Raziel sees images of Janos Audrin, and according to folklore, he preyed on villagers from the mountains until his heart was ripped out by the Seraphim. This heart became known as the Heart of Darkness and could allegedly restore vampiric unlife. Raziel then wonders if Janos was really as monstrous as he was depicted by the Seraphim here. He then comes across a memorial to his Seraphim brothers, and he sees a statue of himself, which he says is the first time he's seen his human image since Kain made him a vampire, and he says he feels a sense of loss and injury. But he doesn't stay here too long, and he finally leaves the stronghold. And getting outside, he's able to look out at Nosgoth in its more lush and lively state compared to the husk of a world he knew before, and this strengthens his resolve to confront Kain. Now moving out into the open world, Raziel starts seeing the corpses of vampires from this era, and he says they're not quite the same as the deranged jackals from Kain's empire, which made this crusade look a lot like ruthless persecution. He then arrives at the pillars, which are pristine in the era, and he takes a moment to admire them. He then of course sees Kain, who's waiting there for him as promised. Raziel tells Kain that Mobius led him here, but Kain says Mobius is a real jerk and it's not wise to listen to him. Raziel says he's here to kill Kain, and that the chase is over. Kain says there is no chase, and that they were drawn here by destiny. He goes on to say that he's seen the ending of their story, and that it's ill-conceived and poorly written, and that he wants to rewrite that ending. Kain then explains that this is the moment where Ariel is slain by dark forces. Kain's younger self would then be born immediately after Ariel's death. Then, Ariel's husband, Napraptor, suspecting treachery among the Circle, corrupted all of them, which we see happen here, as the pillars immediately begin to decay. All of this causing Kain to be born incapable of fulfilling his role as Balance Guardian. So Raziel asks Kain what makes him so special. He's merely the last Guardian standing at this point. Kain says there is no moral debate here because Raziel didn't come here to the pillars to fulfill some high purpose. He came there to satiate his vengeance, which Kain says is okay as he counted on it. Kain goes on to explain that 30 years from this moment he would make a choice. He could either sacrifice himself for the pillars, ensuring the extinction of vampires in the process thanks to Mobius's crusade, or he could refuse the sacrifice, dooming Nosgoth in the process, throwing the pillars out of balance, but either way, the game is rigged. Kain does agree, however, that it is crucial that the pillars be restored. So Raziel then asks, if we agree that the pillars should be restored, wouldn't it make sense for you to die so that a new Balance Guardian could be born to replace you? Kain says no, because then the pillars would go to the humans, and they don't belong to them, they belong to the vampires. Raziel accuses Kain of being arrogant, which Kain laughs off, but then he goes on to say that there could be a third option, hidden in Raziel's presence here and a monumental secret that Raziel has yet to discover for himself. Kain takes his leave, and Raziel finds himself wondering why he stayed his hand. But he was definitely intrigued, and he said if there were any secrets to be unearthed, he was determined to find them. At this point, Raziel notes he felt he's been being watched this whole time, and that someone was keenly interested in his presence. But Raziel moves on, soon coming across one of these smaller secrets, hidden by a door bearing a familiar image, and sealed with a lock opened by the Soul Reaver. This leads to a chamber underneath the pillars, and we find some murals depicting a winged race. And these guys pretty strongly resemble Raziel, except they distinctly look more angelic. These winged creatures were apparently at war with another race of creatures Raziel didn't recognize. The murals seem to show that the pillars were constructed by these winged creatures, who defeated their enemies, but were then afflicted by a bloodlust resembling that of vampirism. And all throughout the chamber, the Reaver is depicted in some context or another. Then we see that the Elder God is hanging out here, and he chimes in telling Raziel not to believe the lies. Raziel expresses that he's skeptical of the Elder's presence and nature, especially knowing now that Mobius serves him. But the Elder then says that Raziel owes him and not to trust Kain. The two kind of argue for a while about who's really trying to manipulate Raziel, but eventually Raziel moves on, looking for more of these monumental secrets to unearth. He then travels through a series of tunnels and emerges in a swamp, which I believe might be Termagant Forest. Raziel then sees another time-streaming device, which is sealed off, but he could possibly gain access to it later. And then he catches a glimpse of the one who he felt has been watching him this whole time, Vorador. Raziel finds a way to the terrace where Vorador was standing, but Vorador is no longer there, and instead Raziel finds the entrance to a shrine, which also has a door which needs to be unlocked by the Reaver. Within the shrine, Raziel finds some more murals that show these winged creatures. There are images illustrating their apocalyptic war, and some further suggesting that they created the pillars, as well as, of course, these shrines where Raziel's finding these murals. And like in the chamber beneath the pillars, the Reaver is often depicted with great reverence. Also, kind of less important to the story is that these shrines are elemental forges where Raziel can imbue the Reaver and activate basins around Nosgoth. These elements, this one being darkness, kind of just act as keys to the other shrines, and aren't permanently applied to the Reaver, hence the basins, which are scattered around Nosgoth to reapply a given element as needed. Raziel recalls that there was a similar shrine near the Seraphan stronghold, and thinks it would be a good idea to check it out next. While Raziel is heading out of the ruins, he sees Vorador waiting just outside to greet him. Vorador says he doesn't really know or trust Raziel, and he says he's been watching him for quite a while as he blithely unlocks ancient secrets only open to someone who's supposed to be some kind of savior to Nosgoth. Raziel asks what the murals are supposed to mean, but Vorador says that they're only fairy tales left behind by an ancient culture, clinging to hope, and that their bloodlines slowly trickled away until one remained. He says that if Raziel is supposed to be some kind of savior, that it's already too late, because the last of them, Janos Audrin, his creator, has long since died. After Vorador leaves, Raziel appreciated how forthright he was, and moved onward to the next shrine, hoping he'd be able to use the time-streaming chambers afterwards to find Janos in an era where he would still be alive. So he passes through the chamber where the Elder is again, only for the Elders to say that all these murals are just the deceits of a failed civilization. So the two of them argue for a little longer. Raziel leaves and ends up finding the next shrine. Inside this one are of course more murals, and these ones show, more definitively, that the winged race were the architects of the pillars. And apparently the pillars' function was to banish the enemies they had during this war. He then activates the elemental forge of light within this shrine, and then is ready to head for the Seraphan stronghold to try to use the time-streaming device. Raziel busts his way inside, and he makes his way through the inner sanctum again, and he finds Kain near the Reaver, which causes Raziel to feel that sense of displacement again. Kain mentions once again how they were drawn to this moment, and this time he starts talking about how their presence isn't changing history, that they've always met here. He says the stream of time would simply flow around pebbles like them. But he then poses the question, if history is so immutable, then how did King William's death stop the Nemesis and start this whole vampire crusade? He goes on to explain that this happened because Mobius made sure that both he and William were equipped with the Reaver, the key to diverting the flow of time. Kain then hands the Reaver to Raziel, reassuring him that he holds all the cards. Raziel says that if this is true, then Kain should be frightened as he could easily destroy him, to which Kain says that's exactly what Raziel does, according to history. But Kain tells Raziel that he has the power to fight it, and he can choose not to. We can then see history and destiny collide as Raziel struggles to stay his hand. He then strikes down with the Reaver, and then King William's tomb is destroyed. There are then visible effects of history straining to reshuffle to compensate for Raziel's refusal to kill Kain. Kain gets to his feet and says he may yet be able to reclaim his role as Balance Guardian. Raziel remains pretty skeptical of Kain, but Kain further encourages him to uncover truths about his destiny, and they again part ways for now. Raziel then finds his way back to the time-streaming chambers, and Mobius is of course waiting there. He's looking pretty nervous, and he asks Raziel why he didn't kill Kain. Raziel says because he had a choice, and he chose, saying that Kain revealed the secret to him about the Reaver. Raziel then goes on to threaten Mobius to activate the time-streaming device, saying that he wants to have it taken to a time before the Crusades of the Seraphan long ago. So Mobius adjusts the device, Raziel activates it, but of course, big surprise, Mobius actually sends Raziel a couple centuries into the future, which he later confirms when he runs into a statue of Mobius holding aloft Vorador's decapitated head. And it's not long after that the spirit of Mobius himself shows up. Raziel suggests that Mobius sent him here to trap him because Kain seems to be a wild card in Mobius's game of destiny, but Mobius replies, saying that he sent Raziel to the future to show him that his failure to kill Kain causes all of this chaos to Nosgoth. Now this of course makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, as there's no way killing Kain now would change the effects of what he did as a fledgling. And Raziel totally calls Mobius out on this, to which Mobius just says, "Go away, stop bothering me." To which Raziel says, "Me go away, why don't you go away?" And he threatens to eat Mobius' soul, which causes Mobius to go away. Raziel leaves the stronghold, gets to the pillars, and sees them in their destroyed, ruined form as he knows them, but now that he understands their significance, he views them with a much deeper, newfound horror. He then sees Ariel, who has found her way to the pillars by this point, and she's talking out loud to herself about Kain and her grief with him, and just loudly being sad like ghosts tend to do. So Raziel greets her by saying her time as a spirit has made her deranged, and tells her that her anger towards Kain is definitely misplaced, because the dark forces carefully calculated Kain's decision to work against Nosgoth no matter what he did. He then suggests that maybe it's too late for the pillars to be restored by Kain's death, and that maybe she's trapped there forever now. Ariel then kind of goes like, "Ew, you're one of them," and she disappears. Raziel then chases her into the spectral realm, and he starts to press the point that all of the Circle Guardians, including her, were very manipulative. And while Raziel does make some good points, at this point he's really just being mean, but he does soon agree to leave her be, and he moves onward. I will make a note now that if you're still wondering, these dark forces they keep referring to are the Unspoken that came up a few times in Blood Omen, and that the one who was possessing Mortanias is the one that murdered Ariel. Now currently, Raziel is trying to head towards the swamp again, which of course means we need to have another conversation with the Elder, and he starts off by trying to make the same dumb point that Mobius tried to make. But Raziel says it kind of looks like the Elder tore the pillars down himself, and kind of questions why he seems to thrive as Nosgoth dies. He goes on to say that he now sees that the Elder is really no more than a parasitic cancer on the world, but he eventually moves on from there as well. Moving through the swamp, Raziel finds that the passage of time had cleared a new path, which is what he was hoping for. This path leads through a ravine that heads to Ushtenheim, where Janos Audron allegedly hunted. He passes through the old village and comes to find Janos' Eyrie, which is currently collapsed and inaccessible. Kain then makes an appearance, and Raziel says one of my favorite lines in the series, "Whenever you turn up, something monumental and terrible happens." But Kain promises that there won't be any drama, and he says he's just biding his time. Kain then confirms that Janos Audron is indeed the key to Raziel's destiny, but says that the dark forces are now scrambling against them. Raziel then asks about these dark forces, but Kain says that they have yet to show their faces. Kain then leaves Raziel to it, and he goes on to find a new shrine. The murals in this next shrine confirm that the winged beings were in fact the first vampires. There are also images showing that the vampiric thirst for blood was a curse left behind by their enemies as they were being banished by the pillars. Raziel then activates this forge, being the element of wind, and this one allows him to gain access to the time-streaming device that he found earlier in the swamp. So he goes back to that chamber, busts the door open, and at this point he's got no choice but to activate it on blind faith. After activating it, he emerges to find that the time-streaming device was set to the era of the Seraphim, and he does note that it was too convenient to ascribe to fate, but he does head back to Janos' Eyrie. He gets back there, and he finds that it's still intact in this era, but he has to find his way to the top as the architecture is designed for those with functional wings. Now, as fate would have it, there is a puzzle of blood enchantments that creates a walkable path from the bottom to the top. Raziel activates this path and gets to the top, and we finally meet Janos Audron. Now Janos recognizes Raziel and warmly greets him by name, but Janos doesn't recognize what Raziel is and asks, "What did they do to you?" Raziel says he's been to the Abyss and back just to come to this moment, and Janos starts giving us some information. He tells us he's an additional Circle Guardian, but rather than guarding a pillar, he's the keeper of the Reaver. He says he's been fighting this long to survive in order to honor his obligation to Raziel. He talks about how he's watched as humans forgot about the ancient vampires and have claimed the pillars for themselves, ignorant of their true purpose. Raziel asks why the pillars summon human guardians if they were made and meant for vampires. Yano says this is because the pillars choose their guardians from birth, and vampires are no longer born. Janos confirms that the murals show the truth, and that Raziel does have some important role in his destiny to fulfill. Janos says that the binding of the pillars must be secured, and that the Reaver is the key, which he has with him. Raziel's pretty surprised by this, because he has not been feeling that sense of temporal distortion that he usually feels when he's around another instance of the Reaver. Janos says the Reaver was forged and enchanted to be able to drink the blood of its victims, but he mentions nothing of consuming souls. When Janos presents the Reaver to Raziel, he feels a sense of dread and yet a strange urge to touch it. But just then, the Seraphim barge in, having followed the path Raziel just made. Janos kind of poofs Raziel over to the next chamber, where the fire shrine is, and Raziel quickly goes to activate the forge. Now, there aren't any murals in this shrine, but we do see a statue that shows what Janos might have thought Raziel would have been. Raziel emerges from the shrine just in time to see that none other than his former human self is attacking Janos alongside his former brothers. They have Mobius's staff with them, which they use to immobilize Janos, and human Raziel rips out Janos' heart, just like in the fairy tales. They take the heart and the Reaver with them as they flee before the Eyrie crumbles. Raziel goes to Janos and says he feels as if he's taken Janos' life, probably twice over. With his dying breath, Janos tells him to go get the Reaver as it was made for him alone, and he dies. Raziel, now outraged, rejects his past and embraces the role Janos had safeguarded for him, hoping also to reclaim Janos' heart and revive him. When Raziel's leaving the area and headed back to the stronghold, demons start showing up. Now, we'd actually seen quite a few demons in the centuries following the Pillar's destruction, but they chase Raziel to this era and reveal themselves to be aligned with the Unspoken, in at least some fashion. Raziel passes by the Elder one final time, and suggests that the Elder may not have created him, but rather just found him in the Abyss. The Elder has nothing to say to this, and Raziel moves on to the Stronghold. Raziel gets inside the Stronghold, and soon finds that the Reaver is placed suspiciously in his path. Once again, Raziel does not feel the displacement that he's used to when he's around another instance of the Reaver, but he does feel the sense of dread and the urge to seize it. In this chamber, Mobius shows up alongside Malik in the flesh, and we really don't get to say that very often about Malik. Now, Mobius is here for a few reasons. One, he disables the Wraithblade with his staff, but also we hear that the Circle members are crying out in the distance for Malik to come save them. So this is happening when Vorador is scourging the Circle himself. Because of this, we get the impression that Mobius is stalling Malik in order for things to play out as he needs them to. And finally, he's trying to provoke Raziel into taking up the Reaver that's resting there in the room, which Raziel does, and then Mobius leaves saying an ominous goodbye. Raziel admits he had taken up the Reaver in blind anger, and he moves on to find his former brothers Melchiah and Zephan standing in his way. He does kill them, and we watch their souls disperse and escape in order to become vampires in the future. Raziel finds that the Reaver does drink blood, and shares its power with its wielder, making Raziel feel vampiric again as it sustains his physical form. But, bound to the Reaver in this way, he is restricted from going to the Spectral Realm for the time being. Raziel moves on and finds his next two brothers, Rahab and Duma, and Raziel comes to feel as if he's in on Kain's blasphemous joke against the Seraphim, as he's providing the corpses that would later become Kain's lieutenants. Raziel then comes across Turel, and he says that the vampire Turel may have eluded his vengeance, but the Seraphim Turel would not. He then comes to face his former human self, who's a bit of a self-righteous jerk. Wraith Raziel runs him through, and soon afterwards the Wraithblade reawakens and coils around its twin. A terrible revelation begins to gather, as the Wraithblade kind of leaves Raziel and enters the Reaver, and then they turn on him, draining his spirit. He suddenly realizes why he had not felt the displacement with this iteration of the Reaver. It's because the ravenous spirit contained within the Reaver had always been his own, and had not been present within this sword up to this point. This was why the Soul Reaver was destroyed when Kain tried to strike Raziel, because it could not consume its own soul. Kain shows up, and he tells Raziel not to fight it, to give in to it. And just as Raziel can't help but give in, he begins to feel a familiar sense of displacement, just as his soul hovered both outside and inside the blade. He came to realize that this temporal distortion was the third option upon which Kain had gambled everything. Kain removes the Reaver, telling Raziel he's now free to reclaim his destiny. But we begin to see that history is reshuffling again, and Kain's memories are shifting behind his very eyes to account for the changes. Afterwards, Kain says, terrified, that they've walked right into the trap of the Hilden, the true name of our dark forces. He tries to warn Raziel that Janos must stay dead, but Raziel is unable to hear Kain's warning as he slips into the spectral realm. Once there, he sees, still bound to him, the Reaver, his own soul, showing that Kain had not prevented his fate, it had merely been delayed. The end, for now.
History abhors a paradox.